Hi guys, based on the chapter review questions and the exam this week, I'm really getting the sense that a lot of you are struggling with A, taking notes, and B, knowing what to study for the exams. Um, and so today I wanted to kind of help out with both of those things by giving an overview of what I think is the best method to take notes. So what we're going to do here today is just go through chapter 8, which you may have already started taking notes on, but if not, then you can just take notes right along with me and pause or slow this video down and even just copy my notes. I'm going to be going over the first several pages, about like the first half of what I did in the lecture with this process. Okay, so if you will please get your book in front of you if you don't have it already, and you can get something to take notes on in front of you. So pause this and get that. And so now I just have my book open to the first page of chapter 8. Okay. There is the list of key terms on the left. I would not necessarily recommend going through and writing out all of those definitions right now. I'm going to suggest writing those definitions out in your notes, but doing it as it comes in the text so you have more context to what they're about. Um, with the objectives, this is a good thing to, after you have taken your notes, is a great study tool, is after you've taken your notes, see if you can meet these objectives using your notes and your understanding of it. And if you can't, then maybe you need to modify how you're taking notes and studying. Okay, you won't necessarily be able to meet all those objectives when you've only done half the chapter, but like when you're done with the chapter, do that. So now let's just start reading. So scientists estimate that more than 50% of the Earth's biomass is made of carbohydrate compounds. And it says biomass referred to the dry weight of all plants and animals. About 75% of the dry mass of all land plants and seaweed are carbohydrates or some form. This includes the plants used to make products such as wood, paper, cotton, linen, and rayon. Okay, so our goal here is really for every paragraph, we need to put one or 2 points. Now there are some paragraphs where I'm like, nah, we'll get to somewhere like, okay, well, that just added some context and it's not necessarily something that we're going to need to study. Um, but let's look at this first paragraph. Are there any important points? It's telling us that carbohydrates can make up a big part of biomass, and it also tells us what biomass is. And so I just have these couple notes here. 50%, greater than 50% of the Earth's biomass equals carbohydrates. Okay, I shorten it where I can. If I have good abbreviations for things, I'll use abbreviations, all right? And then biomass isn't one of our key words, but it gives us a great definition here. And so I'm going to go ahead and write that definition so I understand what biomass is, especially if I did not understand it when I wrote this note. If there's any part of a note that you wrote that you don't understand a term in it, you need to make sure you understand the term. Otherwise, the note taking is kind of useless. It has no relevance to you. Okay, so I wrote in blue here underneath biomass, dry weight of all plants and animals. Okay, so you'll notice here I have lots of colors and I use the colors very strategically. Okay, and some of it is a little bit hard to see because when I scan this, it washed it out. But blue here for me means I am defining something. Okay. When I write in red, it is something that is pointed out differently or especially in the lecture. Okay, so I would also suggest when you do this, you're watching the lecture first, you've printed out those lecture notes and written notes as you're watching the lecture on those pages, and then then you come back and read the book and just follow along with the lecture. Sometimes my lecture skips around from the book because I think things flow conversationally a little bit better in a different order. But still, use the lecture notes, the notes that you took, the notes that I said, and if there are any discrepancies, my lecture notes take precedence, okay? Because I've gone through and corrected some things and changed some things up. And most of the time when I'm telling you, hey, this is, I'll tell you, hey, this is different from the book. So then I have headings in purple. And I kind of have, there's one other color I'm using here. Green I use for some clarifications and things just like to point out at you. And then at the bottom of all this, you can't really tell, it looks red, but this is pink. And I'll go over that, okay? But my point here is multiple colors can help point out things to grab your attention, and it also makes your notes look less boring, okay? So different colors. Okay, so then I also want to point out that 75% of dry mass of all plants is made up of carbohydrates. I have that as a sub point because it's very much related to that 50% of the Earth's biomass point. Okay, and just in case I didn't know what dry mass means, I'm going to think about that, like dry. Oh, well, it's not including the water because water is going to be way, water itself is going to be about 75% of the mass of plants, if not more. And so this is like, if I take out all the water from what's left, carbohydrates are about 75% of the dry mass of plants, okay? And so I have a little note there that no water, okay? So going on to the next paragraph, because of their abundance throughout nature, carbohydrates make up the bulk of biomass and food. Well, okay, that makes sense from the last thing that we wrote. I'm not going to write anything there. Carbohydrates are a major source of energy for humans, providing 55 to 80% of calorie needs. Now, I'm not saying you need to write out every number anytime you see a number, but sometimes when you're seeing data, it can indicate some importance, okay? And I'm not going to ask you exactly what the percentage of calorie needs is, but it's good to know that roughly half of your caloric intake is recommended to be carbohydrates. Okay, so I'm going to jot that note down. Now, when I look at the lecture notes, which if you don't have those in front of you, get those in front of you. So pause this and get those in front of you. When I look at the lecture notes, the number that was put in the lecture notes is different. It's 45 to 65%. This is actually a more accurate number than what the book has. Okay, and so I'm just going to go ahead and put that in red next to that. If I wanted to, it would be totally fine to just write the 45 to 65% too. Okay, so then compared with people in other countries, people in the US have one of the lowest carbohydrate intakes, even so, these organic compounds still provide the bulk of energy in the US diet. Okay, not anything, super important major notes to point out there. So I'm going to stop there with that paragraph. The next paragraph. Carbohydrates provide a reserve energy store for all living things and form the vital structure of living cells. Even DNA, which provides genetic information to all living things, is composed of a carbohydrate base. So this is a totally different topic than the previous paragraph. Okay, sorry, I got a little bit interrupted. I lost my train, but so this is a slightly, it's a different topic than what we were doing before. So this whole section that we're going through is an overview section, right? And so it's going to skip around and go through some different topics. So just to note that, so and also provide some space in my notes, so it's not just so overwhelming, I just put a little line here like, hey, I'm switching topics here, and here's the next topic, okay? And so it's saying that carbohydrates are a reserve energy store, okay? And so I shortened that, right? And it's reserve energy store for all living things and form all living things. Well, okay, yeah. living things are what need energy, right? Like things that are inanimate don't need energy. So I don't need to write all of that. And form the vital structure of living cells, right? And so I put that in there, vital structure of living cells. And it notes DNA. Well, that's an example, right? And so actually this is green here. So I put this DNA in green. Here's an example of what is providing the vital structure for, okay? DNA within living cells, okay? Reading on to the fourth paragraph, understanding the functions of carbohydrates is important to many areas of industries and research. However, it is vital to food science. You will rarely work with a food mixture that does not contain carbohydrates in some form. Okay, this is fluff, right? It's just saying, hey, this chapter is important. Okay, we know. So I'm not going to write any notes there. Last paragraph on page 211, you can group carbohydrates and food ingredients into 3 categories: sugars, starches, and fiber. Anytime I see a list, that's going to be something important, okay? Especially when it's talking about categories, okay? So I want to note that. And so I'm going to write 3 categories. I'm going to underline that, and I'm going to list the categories. However, I remember back to the lecture and I'm following along with the lecture slides. I go back to the slide where I talked about the types of carbohydrates, and there were some differences, right? Number 1, I said sugars is fine. It's a good category name, but it could also be called simple carbohydrates or simple sugars, also saccharides, but the simple carbohydrates and simple sugars or simple sugars was the big one. Okay, so I'm going to put that just in red in parentheses. Sugars was fine, but simple carbohydrates I have in red in the lecture notes, so it's kind of important. I'm gonna put that in there. Now for where the book said starches, I told you in the lecture that we are not saying the second category is starches. We're calling it complex carbohydrates, okay? And that is composed of starches and other carbohydrates with 3 or more sugars bonded together, according to the lecture notes. So I'm going to write, instead of starches, I'm going to write complex carbohydrates, and that in parentheses, it includes starches and carbs with 3 plus sugars, 3 or more sugars, okay? And fiber was my third one, okay? So I have that important list of categories of carbohydrates now in my notes. Turning the page, we have a heading, okay? Anytime you see a heading or a subheading, you need to be writing that down. There were several of the chapter review questions that could have been simply answered, or the answer easily found at minimum, by just finding the correct subheading that used the same words that were in the question, okay? So I can tell that a lot of you aren't really paying attention to these headings and subheadings, and it is a great source of looking up information, even the answers in some case, and so it should be part of your notes. So carbohydrate production, I have in purple. All of my headings and subheadings are in purple. You can use a different color. You can use a different color for subheadings versus headings. All of mine are in purple, and you'll see how I designate subheadings a little bit differently in a second. Okay, so as I'm reading this, I immediately get to a chapter keyword, carbohydrates. So right there, again, this is kind of washed out, but I did it in blue. I write carbohydrates and I look up the definition in the back of the book if it's not really clear in the reading. Like, and this one is pretty clear in the reading. It says all carbohydrates are compounds composed of the elements carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Okay, so carbohydrates, compounds composed of the elements carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Okay, and then it gives me some extra information. All right, it tells us more about the name, right? It means a hydrate of carbon. Okay, so that helps me understand what a carbohydrate is, right? The word gives me some clues. So hydrate of carbon, okay. And then it further tells me, or carbon that's bound with water. So hydrate means bound with water. And I have that in blue here. Again, it's kind of washed out, but it's blue because it's a definition. It's helping me understand it, a definition. Okay. Then I also write down the formula for carbohydrates, that's CxH2OY. And I, the book kind of dismisses that, but that is roughly the formula of carbohydrates. And I do point that out in the notes, in the lecture notes. Okay. And so as I read that paragraph, I'm done. I've got my notes there. Okay, it's really just understanding what a carbohydrate is. The next paragraph, carbohydrates are nature's means of storing solar energy, and through the process of photosynthesis. Okay, I reached another keyword. I'm going to write that keyword definition. I thought I had turned on the cursor for this and it's recording that, but maybe it's not. So I'm going to write that photosynthesis process through which plants convert energy from the sun into glucose. Okay, continuing reading. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, water, chlorophyll, and sunlight. Sunlight is the source of energy that powers the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is a green pigment found only in plants. It traps the radiant energy from the sun and turns it into chemical energy. All green plants use this process for growth as well as energy storage. The equation for photosynthesis is Okay, we are not getting so deep into this stuff that I'm going to be asking you equations. So unless I specify, know this equation, don't worry about that. But from that, okay, so what is important about photosynthesis? Well, carbohydrates are the means of storing plants' energy. And then chlorophyll, it's in italics. It's not one of our main keywords. So don't necessarily feel like I need to define chlorophyll, but what I thought was important in this paragraph is that what it does, right? And how that relates to carbohydrates. Because chlorophyll is not a carbohydrate. It traps the radiant energy from the sun and turns it into chemical energy, right? So radiant energy to chemical energy. This is a concept we've talked about before. And the chemical energy, of course, is glucose. And so continuing on, initially all carbohydrates in plants are produced in the form of glucose. Plants can then convert glucose into whatever form of sugar, starch, or fiber they need at the time. And as you know, then the next paragraph kind of goes into a little bit more detail, but it's saying the same thing, that glucose is being converted by starch, fiber, or sugars, which are then sometimes converted into starches over time. And so just giving more detail. And so this sometimes a figure, drawing something out is better than writing it out. And this is definitely would be one of those times, right? Glucose is being converted, is being turned into one of three things: starch, fiber, or sugars. And the sugars sometimes are converted into starches. And so this little drawing here is how I am making the note for that, right? And so I had 2 paragraphs here that I summarized in one little drawing. Okay, so now I'm to another heading, sugars. And it says the simplest type of the carbohydrates are called sugars. In organic chemistry, the name saccharide has been given to all carbohydrates classified as sugars. Sugar was the common name used before organic chemists developed the naming system presently used to identify organic compounds. Okay, so from that one paragraph that's before our next subheading, really it's just defining what a sugar is, right? And what a saccharide is. So I have my saccharide key term here, and I am just going to write that in blue. Then I get to my first subheading, structure, and I'm still doing that in purple, but I'm going to give it an indentation off to the side a little bit to show that it's a subheading. Another thing that you could do to kind of show headings versus subheadings that I didn't do here, make all your headings, the ones that are in red, capitalized. Um, so if you do this in all caps and then this in just title format, then that kind of designates headings versus subheadings. So as I read now, I'm just going to go ahead and read these next two paragraphs. Sugars are organic compounds. That means sugars contain carbon. All living organisms are composed of organic or carbon-based compounds. Organic compounds are grouped by their structure. For example, all carbohydrates contain hydroxyl groups. A hydroxyl group is an oxygen atom and a hydrogen atom bonded together. A hydroxyl group is represented by the chemical symbol OH, or -OH. As you know, oxygen atoms prefer to bond with two atoms. A second oxygen bond in a hydroxyl group is formed with a carbon atom as represented in the following diagrams. Okay, so of structure, so that first paragraph, I summarize with organic means contain carbon. I actually could, maybe should, have put this in blue, right? It's a definition. It's not one of my keywords, but it is a definition. Then from the second paragraph, all carbohydrates contain hydroxyl groups. And I underline this because even though this is a very small chapter, it's a pretty important concept, and I pointed that out in the lecture. Okay, so I have this underline and I have this whole section that I'm talking about the hydroxyl groups with a star because I told you in that lecture you need to understand this because there's a lot of these in carbohydrates. Okay, so under that I have the definition of hydroxyl group pulled from the book. And then I did a couple little drawings just to help myself realize remember what this looks like when I'm looking at it as part of a drawing of a chemical compound, right? And so I just pulled this from the lecture, but there were some examples in the book that you could use too, and did a couple little drawings just showing what the hydroxyl groups looked like on a chemical compound. Now to the next subheading, monosaccharides. A simple sugar is a molecule that cannot be broken down into a smaller molecule without changing its basic nature. These simple sugars are known as monosaccharides, or sugars that contain one basic molecule. So I have the definition of monosaccharides here. From the lecture notes, I gave you the formula for monosaccharides, for most monosaccharides. So I wrote that down. You also maybe could have written down like what a simple sugar here is, because simple sugar is really just a name for it. Now, yeah, and simple sugars and monosaccharides are not the same thing. Disaccharides are simple sugars also, but and that is part of why. And actually, we really wouldn't want to write down simple sugars because that's part of this, all right? So everything that we're covering in chapter 8 is simple sugars. So that's kind of digressing because that's not really about taking notes. It's more about the content, but okay. And so in the next paragraph, examples of monosaccharides. Okay, so they're about to give me a list, right? Examples. And so it's a list. I know I'm going to need to write some down. So they tell me fructose, glucose, and galactose. But I'm going to finish reading this paragraph before I write anything down because it's better to read it and then think about, okay, what are the most important points? In organic chemistry, the names of saccharides end in "-ose". Fructose is a monosaccharide found widely in fruits and honey. Glucose is the most abundant of the sugars, and it is people's basic energy source. It occurs naturally in blood, grapes, and corn. The body converts all sugars and starches into glucose before using the glucose for energy. Galactose can only be found in animals and humans and is one of the basic sugars found in milk. All these sugars have 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Okay, so it wasn't just a list of the 3 sugars. It gave me some things to know about them. Um, and some of it was what foods they were found, but some of it was just some extra information about each sugar. And then it told me something that was the same about all of them. And so I think about, how do I put that in a format that is easy to read, where and I can quickly reference it. Okay. And so what I did here is put a table, right, with 3 columns labeled glucose, fructose, and galactose. And under each one, I gave like the extra information that told me more about that type of sugar. Glucose said was most common in nature. From the lecture, I told you that it's usually found with other sugars, as a bonded with other sugars. It's not very often found as a monosaccharide. And then the list of foods that each one is found in. Now, some of these foods were from the book and some are from the lecture. So I'm referring to both and writing the full list for each. Okay. So like honey and dried fruit was not listed under glucose in the book, but they are more major sources of monosaccharide glucose. And from the lecture, I kind of pointed out that they say animals, but milk is really where it's found. Okay. Um, and then the one point that was the same for all of them was that they all have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, which makes their chemical formula C6H12O6. Continuing on reading, originally scientists believed sugar molecules existed primarily in a linear form. The carbon atoms were thought to form a line. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms were believed to branch off the carbon atoms at different angles. Scientists now know that most simple sugars in nature. So that paragraph, like, okay, well, they originally thought this, but that's telling me that it's wrong. Okay, like, I'm not going to be tested on that. I'm going to be tested on what it is now, what it's known to be, right? So scientists now know that most simple sugars in nature have a central ring structure. Constructing three-dimensional models of sugar can give you a better idea of how the atoms align with one another. So I'm going to go to the lecture notes, and actually, I'll finish this paragraph. Fructose has a 5-member ring. Glucose and galactose have 6-member rings. So if I go to the lecture notes where I talked about structure, um, so this is where you would be better if you had taken good notes and listened, because my slide on that is a little bit sparse, right? And that's mostly because I was talking through it rather than putting everything dumped on the page. And so what I told you is that monosaccharides can exist in linear form, but in aqueous solutions, there will be a ring-shaped structure. Okay, and so my note here is that in aqueous solutions, monosaccharides, and I have some abbreviations here, form a ring. And then I am drawing each structure. Okay. Now, am I going to have you completely regurgitate any of these structures and know exactly which way the hydroxyl groups are facing on them? No. Okay. But being able to pick out just from a glance, oh, hey, that's for fructose. That's the 5-member ring one. That might be useful. Okay. Also understanding the concept that the book did talk about a few paragraphs later, I think, where we don't necessarily, and I talked about in the lecture, we don't necessarily always write the C for the carbons. It's just assumed, and that's, it's assumed where 2 lines are joining, right? And then where a line ends, or where a carbon should have more, more atoms bonded to it, we assume an H, right? And so I wrote a little note here. There's a carbon here pointing at this corner, and there's a hydrogen here pointing at the end of the line, okay? I also wrote notes that glucose and galactose are 6-member rings, and fructose is a 5-member ring. Okay. So then the final paragraph on page 213, when scientists create diagrams of any ring-shaped organic compound, they simplify the drawing. So this is what I just kind of did on these drawings. They use the junction of lines to represent the location of a carbon atom. They draw lines where hydrogen atoms are located, but they do not write the letter H. In the following example, the diagram on the left shows glucose as a ring with all the atoms represented by lectures. The diagram on the right is the shorthand version of the same molecule. I don't like this diagram on the right because it doesn't actually do what they said in the paragraph, that carbon atoms aren't necessarily written out. But they didn't write out the hydrogen atoms. And so you see actually on that right one in the book, they don't even have the line coming off of the carbon for the hydrogen, and you don't have to, right? It's assumed. Continuing reading, all monosaccharides occur most frequently in a ring structure that contains 5 carbon atoms and 1 oxygen atom. If you're using your brain, you realize that the sentence is wrong because we just drawn 2 monosaccharides that have 6 carbons within the ring structure. Or wait, no, sorry, take that back. We just drew 1 monosaccharide that has 4, right? So glucose and galactose have 6 or have 5 carbons in the ring structure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 6th one is out of it. And fructose has 2 that are out of it and 4 that are in it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So little error in the book there. They differ in the way the hydrogen and oxygen atoms are arranged around the ring. The difference in position affects the characteristics of the sugar and how it will respond in food preparation. Continuing on just a little bit, to understand the importance of the arrangement of the atoms. Okay, so it just told me something about how arrangement affects characteristics of sugar and how it's going to respond. And then it says to understand the importance. Okay, so it just told me this is important. Okay, and so I'm going to start writing a note here. Importance of arrangement of atoms, alpha, and importance of arrangement of atoms, and then subnote alpha versus beta glucose. Because that's what it's telling me. To look at the 2 basic forms of glucose, alpha D glucose and beta D glucose. So as you can see from the following diagram, the alpha glucose and beta glucose have only one difference. That is the position of the hydroxyl group on the right side of the ring. This one change in position determines whether the body is able to digest the sugar. Alpha glucose is the basic energy source for humans. Beta glucose is the main component of dietary fiber that provides bulk for the digestive tract. However, it provides no nutritive value because people cannot digest it. So how do I sum that up into a way smaller couple notes, right? So the position of the hydroxyl group on the right side is the only difference, right? And alpha equals easily digested, beta equals not easily digested. And to kind of emphasize that position of the hydroxyl group, I'm just drawing a little alpha and beta glucose, missing a lot of parts, right? All I'm focused on is this right side, and the OH, the hydroxyl group, is on the bottom on the alpha and on the top with the beta, okay? This is simple drawing showing just how very slightly they're different. To get that point across, like very small difference can totally change the attributes of the sugar. The last paragraph on this page, so far the simple sugars described have a basic formula of C6H12O6. There are also some sugars that contain only 5 carbon atoms. These are riboses. Okay, so I've reached a keyword. Go ahead and continue reading. The body uses them as basic building blocks for ribonucleic acid and RNA. RNA carries the genetic code from DNA and is used for making protein. Okay, so here the important point is some sugars have 5. Everything we've talked about before has 6 carbon atoms. Some have 5, and these are called riboses. So I write that keyword in definition. And riboses are used for ribonucleic acid. So I write that definition. Next subheading is disaccharides. Sugars found in nature do not normally occur as monosaccharides. The sugar molecule structure enables it to readily combine with other sugars to form chains. A disaccharide is 2 joined monosaccharides. Most sugars consumed in the world are disaccharides. So it's told us twice here that monosaccharides aren't really the main sugar, right? And so I'm going to write that down. Most sugars in nature are not monosaccharides. I spelled that wrong, but that's my first note. Okay. And within that also, it gave me a keyword, disaccharide. So I'm going to write that definition. Disaccharides, 2 joined monosaccharides. Continuing reading. Sucrose or table sugar is a disaccharide that contains 1 glucose molecule and 1 fructose molecule. Other saccharides found in the food supply are maltose and lactose. Maltose is commonly found in malted grains. It is made of 2 glucose molecules. This disaccharide is the least sweet. When in powder form, it is tan rather than clear or white, like sucrose. Lactose is the sugar found in milk. It is composed of 1 glucose molecule and 1 galactose molecule. In pure form, it is white and contributes some of the color you associate with milk. Okay, so I read through all of that because this was a list, right? It gave me 3 examples of disaccharides. Okay, it's a list, it's important, and I need to organize it in some way. Okay, for each one, it told me some characteristics about them and where they came from and what they were composed of, right? So this is a great table. So for sucrose, it told me that it is table sugar. The most common source of sucrose is table sugar. Now, there are other sources, right? But table sugar is a big example. And it tells me that it is composed of glucose and fructose. Then for lactose, it tells me the main source is milk, and it's composed of glucose and galactose. It also tells me that it's white in color. For mannose, we learned that it is found in malted grains. It's composed of glucose and glucose bonded together, and it is the least sweet of the disaccharides. It also told me that it's tan. So that's another note that I could put here that I just failed to. Here. Okay. Notice here, by putting it in a table, I've done something for myself. Look at the composition line. Glucose and fructose, glucose and galactose, glucose and glucose. So all of them have glucose. So if I can remember that all of these 3 major disaccharides have our most common sugar, glucose, then now all I have to remember is what the second one is, right? And so lactose is easy because it has galactose. It sounds a lot like lactose. And so I just need to learn that sucrose has fructose as its second sugar, and mannose has glucose. And I wrote the wrong thing here. I just realized that. Maltose should be here, not mannose. Maltose. So, if you're copying my notes, fix that. It's maltose. So now I'm going to continue reading the next sentence that is separated like a chapter, but it's just a sentence. When two monosaccharides join, a hydroxyl group from one and a hydrogen atom from the other separate to form water. So to me, the key thing is, okay, so when they come together, water is formed slash released, right? It goes out of the reaction. And then from the lecture, we learned that this is called a condensation reaction. So I have that little note added there. In the next paragraph, this process of molecules joining and releasing water is reversible. Hydrolysis occurs when a large molecule, such as sugar, is divided into smaller parts by adding water. If you hydrolyze a molecule of sucrose, you will get one molecule of fructose and one molecule of glucose. The body uses this process to digest the disaccharides in foods. For hydrolysis to occur, water must be present. This is why sweetened drinks are not as thirst quenching as plain water. Part of the water is used to digest the sugar and is not available for other functions. Okay, so we just learned that when monosaccharides join, water is formed or released. Well, it's the opposite, right? When disaccharides are broken apart, water is used. Okay, so it's released when they're formed, it's used when they're broken apart. Okay, and so to emphasize that, I am underlining it because then after that, it tells me a lot of things that are like the consequences of that. I'm going to define hydrolysis, and within that, I'm kind of underlining some key things. So reaction occurring when a large molecule is divided into smaller parts by adding water. And then I'm going to take advantage of some things I told you in the lecture notes about hydrolysis, and how hydro equals water and lysis equals break apart. Anytime you can use some root words to understand the definition of some biological terms, it is so great, because not only are you understanding the definition of this particular term, but you're learning something for the future, because a lot of biology uses the same root words. And if you all understand that hydro always means water and lysis always means break apart, then in the future, you have other terms that you're going to immediately understand what they mean. And then finally, from that paragraph, I'm going to write that sweetened drinks are not as thirst quenching because some water is used to digest them, because they've spent a bit of time with that. So it's kind of a key point, is that water is needed for digestion of disaccharides. 3 conditions can trigger this hydrolysis. One condition is the presence of an enzyme to set off the reaction. A second condition is the adding of an acid. A third condition is the addition of heat. So it gave me a list, right? List, I'm going to list it. 3 conditions for hydrolysis. Kind of as an aside, I wrote you need 1 or more, because you don't have to do all of them for hydrolysis. And I don't want to make myself think, reading back my notes, that I need all 3 conditions to be met. So 1, presence of enzyme. 2, addition of acid. 3, addition of heat. Digestion of sugar involves the addition of the enzyme sucrase. This enzyme is present in saliva. I don't really like that sentence because it's talking about digestion of sucrose, not sugar. But yeah. Thorough chewing of your food enables the enzyme to be mixed into the food, so the enzyme can work quickly. Lactose-free milk is produced by adding enzyme to hydrolyze the sugar. I wish they'd left that whole section out, because what the next paragraph is better. Each type of sugar requires a different enzyme for hydrolysis to occur. You can determine the name of the enzyme by simply changing the ose ending of the sugar to ase. For instance, sucrase hydrolyzes sucrose, lactase hydrolyzes lactose. Sucrase is also known as invertase. This is because the fructose and glucose mixture that results from the hydrolysis of sucrose is sometimes called invert sugar. Okay, so from all of that, it kind of gave me a semi-list, right? It told me that to figure out the name of the enzyme, you add a -ASE, ACE. And so I'm going to go ahead and make it a list, right? So I have, and I made it a little table too. So sugar and enzyme, sucrose, sucrase, and then I have in parentheses invertase, because that's the other name for it, lactose, lactase. And even though they didn't talk about it, I'm going to say maltose and maltase, right? Just to emphasize that fact. And then they gave me the definition of invert sugar, so I'm going to write that down. From the lecture, you could also put in these notes that invert sugar is used because fructose is sweeter than sucrose, and so the mixture of the two is sweeter than sucrose, and that's why it's used. Okay, so that, sorry. So then the next part of the page is one of these like, side bulletins that are scattered throughout the book. And when you come to one of these, it's good to read them and write down 1 or 2 points. If it's a big one, you might need to write down 3 or 4. Okay. And so from this one, you go ahead and read it. But my summary of the most important points here is lactose intolerant. And I wrote this in pink, so it's hard to tell it's not red, but it looks pink on my page. Just showing that it's kind of one of the side things. A little bit less important than the other stuff, but good information to know. Lactose intolerant is the inherited inability to produce lactase, common in Native American, Asian, and African Americans. You can buy lactase at the pharmacy, and Lactobacillus acidophilus in yogurt produces lactase. So that's my summary, and just a few points of this whole section, and this would be enough to get you through an exam question on that. So this is where I'm going to stop. I've already occupied 45 minutes of your time with this, but I hope it was useful. Just kind of understanding the thought process of making notes, and hopefully you can use some of this to make better notes and study better.